might start to overlay, okay, so what's going on with your eating? What's going on with your weight during the same timeline? And we start to develop a pattern. So this is Jay, who we're going to keep talking about. So down here, Dad leaves the home, and Jay is suddenly left responsible for caring for his younger brother because his mom has to go back to work because they can't afford to live without his mom's income. So major life change, right? Here, when Jay is in high school and his brother's a few years behind him, late adolescence, Jay's brother starts using drugs. Now, major life event because Jay has sort of assumed the father role, right, and feels a lot of responsibility for that. Then Jay goes to college, he meets his girlfriend, they get engaged, and today he's seeking treatment. So if we overlay some of the important things, we notice that Jay says he remembers times of emotional eating and weight gain pretty quickly after his dad leaves home, and I'm going to read you a little bit of a narrative that I developed based on his case, de-identified of course, with a few changes just in case, so it's not a real case, but, and then experiences his first loss of control episode here and more weight gain around the time when he starts to identify his brother's using drugs, starts the whole process of dieting and weight cycling, and probably has full-blown binge eating disorder in college. Had lost 40 pounds, gained 60 pounds, lost 20 pounds, you know, that whole cycle. Tries his first very low-calorie diet right before meeting his girlfriend, had lost a ton of weight, like 80 pounds, doing a BLCD. Not surprisingly, binge eating went haywire shortly thereafter, but at his low weight was feeling very self-confident, met his girlfriend. He has regained the weight, got engaged, binges, loss of control and weight gain, and now he's in treatment. Encouraged by his now fiance.
Is it the girlfriend he met right after?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, same girlfriend is now the one he's engaged to. So after you're developing the interpersonal inventory, and we're going to go into the case of Jay, more explicitly talk about his problem areas, talk about treatment approaches and so forth, but you want to develop a treatment contract. And that can be in writing. You could just sketch it on a piece of paper, you know, like, oh, I'm thinking we probably need 15 or 20 sessions. We're going to meet weekly, or we're going to meet every other week if the patient, you know, if there's some like scheduling thing or something. So applying this to real world matters. And identify the problem area or areas you're going to address. And you really try to develop that collaboratively. So this is what I'm suggesting based on the evidence and the research, but does that work in your life? So are you a college student who's moving away in 3 months and we have 12 weeks? Then we're not going to meet for 20 weeks, right? So like that's a reality check. So when you're applying this in private practice or clinical practice in general, you do have the real person sitting in front of you. And you can, IPT is meant to be structured but not prescriptive. There's not like, exact right way to do it. So I'm going to rely on this video to show you what an example of a closeness circle looks like, I think. Okay, let me stop. So this is Jamie Young, and she's going to demonstrate IPT for teen depression, because again, there's limited training out there for eating disorder. I'm going to show you some, but I wanted to mix in a variety of cases. So this is around depression, but it's the use of creating a closeness circle in a session, okay? And it's a role play.
Something in the way that
And that's Laura Muffson.
in the way you say things, in the way that you problem solve, and it's not this humongous task that we're asking for. It's tweaking little bits and pieces of how you conduct your relationships that has a snowball effect and can have a very large impact on that relationship and therefore their mood. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to role play.
So Tara, as we were talking about last week, the focus of this treatment is really on improving your relationships, with the thought that as we improve your relationships, your mood will also start to improve.
Okay.
In order to do that, what I'd like to do over the next few weeks is really learn about the important people in your life. And I use something called a closeness circle to do that. It's sort of a picture of the important people in your life, like telling a story and who are the important characters. Okay? So it's just, I'm going to draw these like a bullseye. Okay? And you're going to go in the middle, and then there's going to be a few other circles. Okay? So this first circle here are the people who are the most important to you. They affect your mood in either a positive or negative way. They're the people you feel the closest to and the most important in your life. The next circle here are people who are still important to you, but you may not feel as close to them. They may not be as important to you as the people in here. And then the outer circle are for people who you still think are important for me to know about. You may not feel as close to them as the inner two circles, but they're still important and impact your mood. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we have you in here.
Okay.
So who do you think you would put in sort of this innermost circle?
Definitely my mom.
Okay. Anyone else that would go in there?
My sister, Lisa,
And how old is she again?
13.
Okay. And anyone else that goes in there?
Probably my boyfriend, Eric.
I know from what we talked about last week that sort of him not being in school has been hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyone else that goes in that innermost circle?
I don't think so.
What about this next circle?
Well, I guess my dad.
Okay. Anyone else?
And one of my friends.
And what friend is that?
April?
April? And is April in school with you?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else that would go on that circle?
That's pretty much it.
What about on this next circle?
Well, I guess I'd have to put my dad's girlfriend there.
And her name?
Sue.
What about other people?
And her two sons. There's James and Tom.
Okay, so we have Sue, Tom, and James. Is there
Mhm.
anyone else that would go on that circle?
And this one other girl at school who's a friend of mine. Her name is Gabby.
Okay. So I feel like I have a pretty good sense then of the people who are most important to you. If you discover over time that somebody else comes to mind and you want to add them in, you can just let me know.
Okay.
So what I'd like to do now is really get a good sense of these people and these relationships. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions to try to understand more what's working in the relationships, what's not working. So is there somebody that you'd like to start with first?
I guess probably my dad.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about your relationship with your dad.
Well, as you know, my parents are divorced, so I see my dad once a week, and sometimes more often because he'll have every other weekend with me.
What's that like for you when you spend time with him?
Well, I don't know, it used to be better. It's just kind of like, I feel like we argue and we just get pissed at each other.
Can you tell me a little bit about what those arguments look like?
Well, he just keeps, I don't know, it's like when I'm at his house, he expects me to act like it's my own house, but he doesn't do anything to make it feel that way.
So what do you mean by that?
Like, I have to buy my own stuff when I go over there, and it's just ridiculous. It's like, come on, like, can't you spend a little bit of money on your daughter?
What types of things do you have to buy for yourself?
Like, I like a certain snack, and he knows that. You would think that when I'm coming over, he would just have it. And there's certain things that I really don't like to eat, and so you would think that it would be important to have stuff that I like.
But he hasn't done that.
No, I just have to remember to bring them over.
And is that something that you've talked to him about before?
Well, I never said it like the way I'm saying it to you, like that obvious, but I kind of mentioned like, oh, there's nothing to eat around here. Just doesn't seem to get the hint.
Okay. So that sounds like one thing that really makes you feel like it's not really your home,
Yeah.
even though he wants it to feel that way. What else about being over there makes it difficult for you?
It's just, Sue's two sons, he keeps trying to like force us to hang out and be a family, but they're not my family. Like, that's ridiculous.
Okay. So that sounds like that's been a point of contention between you and your dad.
Yeah.
What does he do to communicate that he wants you to act like a family?
He'll just, if we're all in the house, he'll try to say like, oh, why don't you ask James how his day was? Or, why don't you go over and see if you could, talk to Tom a little bit more. And it's like, well, I'm just relaxing. I'm just like sitting there and reading a book. And then you expect me to stop what I'm doing and try to ask these guys. Why don't they come and ask me?
And so what happens if you don't? Like if he tells you to go over and talk to James or to do something with Tom and you sort of stay reading, what happens then?
Well, usually, sometimes I'll do it. Especially if it's obvious. But if I could get away with it, I'll just roll my eyes and sit there and kind of ignore him. And then later he'll I know he'll say something. He'll just be like, oh, should be more, friendly. He'll kind of say it like during dinner or later.
And how do you feel when he makes those comments?
Well, I just think it's unfair. Why do you put it all on me to do that?
So it's feeling like it's mostly your job to be the one to sort of initiate that.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's a real problem when you're there, sort of feeling like you don't feel quite at home because your stuff isn't there. And also just that you have to sort of act fake in some ways with, James and Tom.
Yeah, I don't think James and Tom care. I mean, they're teenage boys. It's like my dad and Sue that seem to think it's a big deal.
Okay. So you mentioned before that things used to be better between you and your dad. Can you tell me a little bit about what things were like before?
I guess he would, instead of me always having to go over there, he would come over to us and spend time at our house.
And what types of things did you do when he would come over to your house?
Well, sometimes he would take us out, like just for a day out. And other times, like maybe we'd cook dinner together, something like that.
And it sounds like you liked those times better?
Yeah, especially if like, if my mom had to work late or something, he would come and make dinner with us. And that was really fun. But he almost never comes over anymore.
When did that change?
I would say about maybe 3 months ago.
So really recently you've noticed that you just haven't been doing as much with him.
Yeah, it might have been before. I don't really.
And so now the expectation is that you're mostly spending time together at his house?
Yeah, I don't know why.
And what do those times look like? So let's say it's a weeknight and you go over to his house. Can you take me through what that looks like?
I just go in, I say hey, and if I have homework left to do, maybe I'll do it. He usually asks me. And then it's, sort of getting ready for dinner, and my dad and Sue usually just do that. I don't really help out. So I'll just watch TV.
And do you talk to your dad when you're over there? I mean, does he ask about your day or other things?
He'll ask how school went. Like when I walk in the door, he'll ask me. But then after that, it's pretty much like he's hanging out with Sue in the kitchen, and then I'm watching TV, and then we'll have dinner. And dinner we talk a little bit. But then after that, he's watching TV. And it's like, we're just kind of doing our own thing for the most part.
So it sounds like even though you're over there, you're kind of doing separate things for the majority of time other than dinner.
Yeah.
How does that feel for you?
I guess I don't understand why I have to go over there. Like, why can't I just stay in my own house, in my own room with my stuff, if we're just gonna sit and watch TV separately?
So that sounds hard.
Yeah, but my mom also makes me go there too.
So it's not really your choice?
No, neither of them really give me a choice.
If it was your choice, how much time would you spend with your dad?
Maybe like just every other weekend instead of on the weeknights. It's hard too because I have to go to school, so it's rough to have to stay over somewhere else.
So ideally, it would be seeing him more on the weekends. And it sounds like you'd also like to be doing more things with him the way that you did before. Either cooking dinner together or maybe going out on those excursions rather than just sort of being there. On the weekends, is it any different when you're there with him on the weekends?
Well, he'll make more of an effort to do something with us, but usually he'll try to include Sue's sons, like James and Tom. You know, will usually have to come along, or so we can't just do something. Like, I really like going to art museums sometimes, but James and Tom hate it, so we never get to go. And I know that my dad likes to go, but he won't go anymore because we have to force them to come.
Have you ever talked to him about maybe spending more time alone with him or with you and your sister?
I just don't know how to bring that up because I feel like he doesn't want to.
So it's been hard to bring that up. And so when you're spending the day with him, how are you noticing that it's impacting your mood or how you're feeling?
Yeah, I'm just like really crabby and kind of like annoyed and not in a good mood.
Do you think he notices that?
Yeah, he always makes it worse.
What does he do?
He'll make these comments like, uh-oh, you look like you're in a bad mood, and then he'll say that in front of everybody.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it's not something that I need broadcasted all over the world.
So those comments sound...
And sometimes I'm not even in a bad mood, but he'll just say it, and then that puts me in a bad mood.
Okay. So it sounds like right now, when you're around him, you're kind of feeling irritable, and it's worsened by the fact that he'll make those kind of comments. And has he always sort of made those types of comments to you?
Well, no, because I haven't always been like this, so.
So do you notice that sort of, since you've been feeling depressed, the relationship has changed with your dad?
Yeah, I think that we're not close at all. That's why, maybe before I put him on that inner circle with my mom, but I just don't feel like we're there.
And what specifically do you feel like has changed since you've been feeling down?
Talking to each other, doing stuff.
And how much, it sounds like part of that seems to be that he's not suggesting those things anymore. But do you feel like maybe you're sending a message somehow that you don't want to be spending that kind of time with him?
Yeah, because I don't want to go over there. So I am in a bad mood. I think that stresses him out if I'm over there and I'm not like the perfect daughter when Sue and James and Tom are around, and I'm not like pleasant, I think he probably gets stressed out by that.
What about your dad do you like? So kind of thinking back, particularly when things were better, it sounds like you like to do things together, but what else do you like about your dad?
He's pretty open to doing stuff that we like. I mean, he'll say yes and he'll participate. Or he used to. He doesn't do that anymore.
Okay. So that he's open to sort of doing things.
Yeah.
And when you used to do these things together, or even now when you get time, I don't know if you ever get time, just the two of you, do you notice that it impacts your mood in a positive way?
Well, I mean, I was in a better mood before when we were doing stuff.
Are there other things that you like about him?
Yeah, I mean, he's nice. Like if I need help with something in school, he's pretty smart, so he'll help me out. He doesn't, like yell at you when you get something wrong in school. So
It sounds like school is one thing you guys can talk about, or that he checks in with you about.
well, at least how I'm doing in school. Like I don't really talk about my school friends or anything with him.
Okay. Are there other things that you find difficult to talk to him about?
Not wanting to hang out with Sue and James and Tom all the time and pretending to be this like happy family.
What about like with Eric, or how things are going, or how you've been feeling? Can you talk to him about those things?
I used to, but I think he kind of gets uncomfortable.
What does that look like?
He just he likes Eric, so he'll ask how he's doing, but I don't think he wants to hear details about our relationship.
Okay. And what about in terms of how you've been feeling, or how this has been a really tough year for you? Is he aware of that?
Well, he definitely notices it because he says, "Oh, you are crappy again today."
Okay.
And I'll try to joke about it as if like that's going to get me into a better mood, but it just doesn't.
And it sounds like it in fact makes it worse.
Yeah.
Okay. So you don't feel like you can really talk to him about what's going on in terms of your feelings.
No, I don't think I want to either.
Okay. And are there things, other than what we've talked about, it sounds like there's a number of things that have been challenging with your dad, but are there other things that you don't like about your dad or about your relationship?
I think those are the major things.
And, when you're able to talk to him about things like school, it sounds like he can be helpful if you're having a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Are there times that his reactions to you aren't so helpful?
Yeah, like he'll try to correct me, or like even if we're just sitting for down, like sit up straight, have to look nice when you're sitting up, or like when I was playing soccer, I was just playing around and he was telling me that I wasn't like kicking the ball correctly, and that's just annoying because we're trying to have fun.
So it feels like he's making a lot of comments to try and make you do things differently.
Yeah.
And since you've been sort of feeling this way and have sort of been less interested in going to his house, has he talked to you about that at all?
No, he just says that, oh yeah, I know you don't want to go, but it's my turn.
And it sounds like there's a lot going on with him in terms of just sort of not wanting to be there and feeling like when you're there it's not, really the kind of time you want, and that he's forcing things with Sue and her kids. Are there things you would like to be different in the relationship?
Well, I don't think that James and Tom care if we're best friends.
Okay.
So, I'm old enough to know how I should be with people. So it's kind of ridiculous if he tries to tell me that I should go and talk to them and ask them about this. So I wish he would just stop trying to force me to act a certain way around them.
Okay, so that's one thing you'd really like to be different. Anything else you'd like to be different?
Well, if he actually wants to welcome me in, I would appreciate if he has some of my stuff there and lets me keep some of my stuff there.
Okay. So sending some sort of message to you that you're welcome there and you're really a part of the family.
And not always having to be with their family. They live with him, so they get to hang out with him all the time. I feel like if I'm there for a weekend, then I should get at least some time where I get to do an activity or something with just my dad and not Sue and her kids.
Okay. So also getting to spend sort of unique time. Would you be okay if your sister was involved in that time, or do you really want sort of one-on-one time?
I guess both. I understand my sister is going through probably the same thing, but even if it's a little time, just that everybody, sits in the living room while the two of us make dinner this time, that is fine.
I realize I didn't ask you, do you and your dad argue about things?
Yeah, I mean, we'll argue about that, the way, say, oh, you're rolling your eyes, and I'll say, no, I'm not, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's more him making comments like, you could have said that nicer, or you're rolling your eyes.
Yeah.
Are there times where those arguments escalate?
We don't scream or anything. It's just kind of like, I just stop talking and just roll my eyes and go somewhere else.
So it's more sort of you withdrawing. And then what happens the next morning or when it's time for dinner?
We'll just be like, hey, have breakfast and do our own thing, and that's it.
So it doesn't sound really like there's a lot of fighting necessarily going on, but just sort of a disagreement about sort of how things should be in the house.
Just being annoyed at each other.
And do you get the sense that he's annoyed? He makes those comments to you. Do you get a sense that that's because he's annoyed at how you're acting?
I think so.
Is there anything else about your relationship with your dad that you think is important for me to know about? So just to sort of reiterate, it sounds like in terms of changes, it would be figuring out a way to feel more at home there, which really involves him putting in some effort in terms of having your things and finding time for the two of you to spend time alone or with your sister. And it sounded also like those comments that he makes kind of make things worse instead of make them better. So that would be another thing that would be important for you, for things to be different.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that those are things that we can really talk about as we move on in treatment, because I know that when you're over there, you're pretty unhappy right now. And so I think if we can make a change in that relationship, we may see some changes in your symptoms. Does that sound okay? Okay. Would it be okay if we sort of moved on?
Yeah.
Okay. So you see how long she spent talking about just the dad, right? Do you have a sense of why?
She's trying to get clear of the dynamics of the relationship. Yeah.
And try to understand, okay, let's do a little pop quiz. With your IPT hat on, do you have a sense of what problem area might be showing up here with this person? Okay. Think about those four.
Yeah, what were they again?
So they're grief, interpersonal role disputes, role transitions, and interpersonal deficits. Okay.
Maybe some grief. Yeah.
So you're all kind of right. So it's a complicated scenario, right? She clearly has grief, and there is some discrepancy in the literature about whether or not grief should be reserved explicitly for death. In the IPT for depression literature, the grief problem area is reserved for death. In the IPT eating disorder literature, grief is seen as loss of a relationship. So my guy Jay that we talked about when his dad left the home and left their family, obviously a grief response there. So it's sort of up in the air. It doesn't matter really, I don't think, which literature you rely on. Just know that if you conceptualize it with your patient in practice, that this is a grief thing and it's affecting their mood constantly, then let's go there, right? I hear a lot of role dispute and role transition, right? And if you are going to reserve grief for death only, then any other losses, not death related, are usually about transition. It's usually about the transition in the relationships that happen when you lose an important relationship. But primarily what I think Jamie's honing in on is the disputes, right? They're sort of at an impasse where the patient isn't talking about what's making her so unhappy. And so immediately from an IPT perspective, we're thinking, this isn't something we can change, right? We can give the patient a voice, we can problem solve with her and role play with her about how to talk to her dad about what she wants, right? She has sort of said, I don't really know how to do that, I don't feel safe bringing that up, it feels like I don't wanna, rock the boat a little bit, but she's clearly unhappy. So from that perspective, we could talk about it as a role dispute and really give her some communication skills and practice to help her change the relationship potentially with her dad, who sounds like potentially invested in having a good relationship with her. So there wasn't a lot that I heard in there. Please, I'm open to discussion. It didn't seem like her dad didn't want a relationship with her, right? He's just not aware that what's going on between the two of them is affecting her this way. Yeah.
Is there a way you phrase this, like how it use interpersonal? Sorry, in other therapy models, you might use interpersonal skills to make your chances better of things going the way you want. Is there a way you practice it in IPT? Like maybe in this case, the dad is receptive, but in another family, the dad is using substances or just not going to be receptive. You don't want the person to do all this work and then be feeling muffled.
Yes. Yes. So two parts to the question. One is, are there tools? Absolutely. Jamie, in her work in IPT for depression for adolescents, has developed a set of communication skills, and I have a copy of that for you to look at here, and we'll talk about them explicitly and give examples. So that's been used primarily with adolescents. I can't tell you how often I use it with adults, because guess what adults really stink at communicating too? Sometimes, especially in affectively charged relationships, right? So I use communication skill training a lot, like just really like I statements, really like direct stuff. But then the second part, if when you're listening, the person, the dad in this case is using substances or, seems like he's really sort of disengaged in the family, doesn't want a relationship, then we might be processing what it feels like to sort of accept the change in that relationship and get support for the loss of that relationship from other people in your life. So still working on giving you a voice, this patient a voice, but maybe not to the dad. And I'm usually explicit about that. Like I might say, it's gonna really stink if we do all this work and your dad is like, right? Or hi when you get home and he doesn't want to talk to you. So, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't impact you to lose this relationship. So we need to be thinking about ways in your life where you get support around what it feels like to lose an important relationship in your life, or to rely less on that relationship, things like that. So we're gonna just go through, I think, some tools of the intermediate phase, and then we'll break for lunch. Okay? So the initial phase, just to review, yeah.
Sorry, just to go back to this.
Yeah.
Do you have, what do you do when you have someone who literally just can't fill in the circle? It's like almost nothing there.
No one there, meaning?
Maybe one person.
So then it's a question of whether IPT would be effective, because if there's literally no one, two scenarios. Sometimes everyone's on the way outside. And I might say something like, of the people on the outside, is there anyone that feels like they might be able to be pulled into a closer circle through some work? Someone you used to be much closer with, or someone that you feel like has potential to be a closer relationship, but you just sort of haven't been able to make that happen yet, then it might be that we target that relationship. But if there's really no one on the circle, then IPT is probably not going to be that effective unless we're working from an interpersonal deficit standpoint. But again, then you have to sort of understand, has this person had a history of any closer relationships? So at a different time of your life, did this circle look different? Were there ever people on the inside, and what happened to those relationships? And does your patient mourn the loss of those relationships, or are they like, I don't need anybody, totally like not needing it? If that's the case, then IPT isn't probably a suitable treatment. They
hurt and they say, I don't need anybody now, I don't want people in my life, I don't want
person? What did that look like? Is that person still even, in the orbit? Then there's potentially room to do some IPT there, but probably if it's like really avoidant, like I don't want anybody, then they don't have any motivation to work on the relationships. And maybe what a course of CBT to address some of that, like all or none mentality, might be helpful before you launch into this.
The client in that film, at the very, very start, almost said, for the important people, a negative. Just started to say that. And I thought, well, that raises a big question. I mean, I think she's talking about dad and that's the problem. But, the bully at school, can that person be on the inner circle? Not a bullying person at all. Can you do that?
Yes, you can do that if it's really about how you conceptualize it and how the patient, because remember, you're going to give the paper, ideally in the best case scenario, you're going to give the paper with a clipboard to the patient and have her or him, where they do it themselves. Because you get so much information by letting that happen. So if they write the bully on the inner circle, then that tells you how powerful that influence is. Usually what happens, excuse me, is they write, if you have 3 circles, they usually write the bully's name like way up in the corner over here, which also tells you something. It's really important, but it feels really negative or it feels really bad and I don't want to know that it's close to me, but still probably important to talk about. So she stayed on the dad for the clip that I showed you, just because I didn't want to show you this 2-hour-long thing. You would do that same type of digging analysis with every reasonable person on the circle. The people that, if she's like Aunt Joe is a great person in my life and just, supportive of me, you probably don't have to go in depth like that. Just reinforce that because I'm so glad you have that person. And your job as a clinician is to remember, because if we ever get to the place of, look, we're probably not going to improve the relationship with this person, so let's get support from that person. Aunt Joe might show up as a really important person there, and you might have to role play what it feels like to say, I'm really sad about not having a relationship with my dad, because that's a hard conversation for a kid to have, even with a trusted other. But that type of really digging in and understanding what's going on is for the people that you think are really affecting this person's mood and eating. The other note I made to myself there is this is for depression, and so it's really sort of, I think at one point Jamie said, does your dad know that this affects your mood like this? Assume that no parent or peer ever knows that what is going on affects their eating, right? Because eating disorders are typically so secretive and so based in shame that, Jay, the person I'm going to spend time talking about, has binge eating disorder and has hid it from his girlfriend and fiance wife for years. So, very rarely do I interact with a person who says, my parents know I have binge eating disorder, and I can sort of go to them and say, when you do this, I binge eat. Very rarely. We might get there in treatment, believe it or not, particularly with a spouse. That I've had a lot of sessions where we bring a spouse in and talk about diagnosis and what that means. But just sort of, I think a basic assumption would be, does anybody know that you're eating this way? And usually the answer is no. So that's like the next step. Other thing I want to comment on, IPT for depression, as you know, is very similar to IPT for eating disorders, and it's okay to talk about mood. Because in the IPT for eating disorder model, mood is still upstream of the eating behavior. So where Jamie says, how does this impact your mood? That's a perfectly appropriate IPT for eating disorder question too. The next job would be to say, and when you feel that way, do you find that then you're more likely to binge eat? Or does that then trigger you to use food to cope, or whatever words you might use? So I just would add that sort of next step of linking to the eating behavior. Does that make sense? And then thinking full circle, she sort of said, does your mood impact your relationship? Like, when you show up grumpy, does that make your dad respond to you differently? I might say the same thing with the idea of also, after you've finished binging, do you find that you're less engaged in the relationship, or do you find that the desire to binge sort of isolates you? Like you feel like you have to hide, or you don't want to go home because you don't have access to food, and that's the primary way you cope. So you might be looking at how the eating disorder behavior is then cycling back and affecting the relationship by using words like that. Good? Yeah.
Is that public video or?
It's on YouTube. Yeah, yeah. And I put the resource, it's on the slide.
Oh,
Yeah. Or it should be on the slide. Okay, so in the intermediate phase, so the part that I didn't sort of wrap up there is that you would then, at the end of the initial phase, say to your client, so I think we have a pretty good idea after you did the closeness circle, you had really gotten a good sense of the couple really important relationships, you have a sense, okay, this is a role dispute with dad, and maybe a role transition with the divorce and having to change houses. You might say to the client, I really conceptualize it this way, and it sounds like as we've been talking, you're really having some disputes with dad, and I think that we can work together to give you some new tools and new skills so that you can approach that relationship differently and make some improvements there. And what we know is that when people improve their relationships, that their mood tends to improve, and that their eating behavior, for example, binging, tends to get less intense, less frequent. Because what we know is that the interpersonal relationships, these close people and the relationships you have, are influencing your mood and your eating behavior. So we're going to go straight up to really working on that relationship here. Then you would set the treatment contract. We're going to do this over the next, several months in approximately 20 sessions, or however many we have left, 15 sessions. And the responsibility is really going to shift now. I've been doing a lot of questioning you, digging in, like that, all that 30 minutes was just on dad. So imagine doing that on then mom, and then sister, and then one friend. Like, it takes a long time. And you've done the timeline. What does it look like for you over the course of life? What are big transitions? The timeline is also a really nice way of helping you look for things that might be transition markers. Oh, we moved. Big transition. Moving in adolescence is so hard on kids. You probably know that in the work you do. If they have any predisposition to eating disorder, that's a very common transition time. My grandmother died when I was 15. Then suddenly you're thinking about grief. You're asking those questions. Then you develop the treatment contract and say, now we're moving into the work phase where we're going to start learning how to affect these relationships through different communication. We're going to role play. We're going to talk about things. And your job is to come to session prepared to do some work on things, which means you have to pay attention to how these relationships are impacting your mood and your eating from week to week. So you really sort of give them the, not homework in a CBT way, but the responsibility of coming in prepared. And how you start intermediate sessions isn't, how are you today? Although you'll hear that in training videos, it's more like, what work have you done on your goals? Or have you noticed anything about relationships that have affected your mood or eating during the last week? So you really sort of set it up from the beginning, like we're here to do our work in a way that's clinically normal and appropriate.
At any time during the treatment, do you work with the parents?
The parents? So I have done that, yes, not a lot, usually no more than sort of 1 or 2 sessions. Because I treat mostly adults, I've done it more with spouses, and I'm happy to talk more about what that looks like, but yeah. Okay. So once you and the patient agree on the formulation, you enter what's called the middle or intermediate phase of treatment, and the goals here are to work on the 1 or 2 problem areas that you've identified in those initial sessions. And again, we're trying to make sure that we link the symptoms to the problem areas. So after the break, we're going to go in a lot of detail about the problem areas and really dig in with case examples and so forth. But as a reminder, grief, role disputes, role transitions, interpersonal deficits, and potentially life goals. So here are your tools. Remember we went through the tools in the initial phase? These are your tools for the intermediate phase. So number one, use of the therapeutic relationship. Just like any other treatment, if you don't have a good relationship with the client, the therapy is probably less effective. So just being you, being warm, being empathic, being encouraging and supportive, non-judgmental, that stuff shows up a lot during this middle phase because you're asking people, the patient, to try something new. So if they don't feel safe with you to try something new, you're not going to get very far, right? You're asking them to role play, which generally people don't feel comfortable doing anyway, right? I mean, when I say role play to you guys, I see people like, oh, I'm here to just listen, I don't want to talk. So I get that. So we're trying to create an environment where, like, it's silly, it's okay, right? We can practice 5 times if you need to, and it's okay if you say the wrong word. So really lightening it up a little. At the same time, respecting and encouraging affect. So if someone, I mean, sometimes people get really invested in role plays and can really feel and let it be. I think it's as, when I keep saying you're an active, engaged therapist, sometimes active engagement means being quiet, right? And actually being present with someone who's experiencing a lot of sadness, for example. That's okay. So we don't have to fix it. We don't have to jump in and solve it. We don't even have to necessarily immediately label it for them, even though we're trying to help do that. Sometimes just letting it be is okay too. And what that teaches a person is that it's okay to have feelings, that they're not being judged because they have feelings. So acceptance of painful affect and learning to use affect in relationships is pretty critical. Other examples that happen is sometimes I'll say to my patient, so that was the newspaper reporter version of what happened. Do you have could you tell me that story again, like in a more sort of meaningful way for you? And people often laugh because there's like the data reporting and then there's the real experience of what happened. And sometimes people need to get the data reporting out before they can go deep. And so I'll actually label that change for them. So I have a sense of the facts now. Now what actually happened? How were you feeling when that happened? What went on? And so I sometimes joke that it's the newspaper version. What usually gives me a clue is if the patient is saying, you know, my mom called me a fat piece of crap and told me that I was never going to get a boyfriend if I didn't lose weight, and then I went and binged for the rest of the evening, and they say it just like that, there's a disconnect, right? And you cannot feel completely absent of feeling if your mother says that to you. And so I might say that, or they'll laugh. My mom told me that I was a total fat loser and that I would never amount to anything as long as I was fat. And, you know, like, and I'm thinking, And I might even say, boy, if I were in your shoes, I would feel really hurt by that. But you're laughing about it. And so I'm just curious what's going on there. And usually that will sort of change the nature of the relationship even in the room a little bit. It's not often that peers or parents do that for people. So what an opportunity to help them remember that how you present information filters or contributes to the message that's being received. So there's a difference between content affect and process affect. So content affect is what happens when the person is describing how he or she felt in the moment that the incident was happening. So my mom called me a fat slob, and I went into my bedroom and cried for 3 hours. And I felt awful. I felt depressed. I felt disappointed. I felt worthless. I felt hopeless. I binged, and then I felt disgusting, and I felt fat, and I felt all these things, right? That's all content affect. Then there's process affect, which is, how are you feeling as you recount this story? What's happening for you right now? sometimes that's when people actually emote. Because when you call attention to the present, they get out of the newspaper mode and into feelings. And sometimes, you probably know this, there's a real disconnect between emotion and like awareness of emotion. So I might say something like, what are you feeling in your body? What's happening? And people might say like, I feel super tight and tense up here, or I feel butterflies in my stomach, or I feel hot in my face. And I might encourage them, like, okay, let's stay there for a minute. What is it like to feel that way? What emotion do you think that is? And sometimes people have no idea. No idea. So our job, I think, is to partially help them make some of those connections. Let them know that it's okay to have that emotion. It's also okay to know what that emotion is. If you can't label your emotion, it's really hard to know how to cope with it. If you have no idea what you're feeling, then how do you fix it? One of my patients says, so I'm still doing this feel the feelings thing. And I laugh every time she says it, it's funny. So also notice and address avoidance. Yeah.
Going back to the feeling,
Yeah.
that's probably like their way of coping, right? And living, so shut it down. Do you give them guidelines, like, because I see that potentially opening up more hurt and potentially opening up more conflict when they then go back home. And so, like, do you draw some parameters around that? Like, okay, when we're in session, this is a safe place, and like, so how do you, because that's their coping mechanism, and so how do you open it up, and then, you know, oh, and by the way, when you leave, when you walk out the door, lock it back up again, like, so how do you
Yeah. So
not open up a can of worms?
So two primary responses, and please feel free to add in for the people that do work too. One is, I would say, I don't believe that there's like a faucet that once opened, you don't ever get control of it again. I think patients fear that that's the case. And so I don't want to reinforce that. I want them to know that emotion and affect is a normal part of living. On the other hand, I also recognize that if you're inexperienced in dealing with emotion, it can feel overwhelming at times. And I say that. I also try to say, and I think this is with any clinical treatment, when you start getting to the issues, it's pretty common for stuff to feel uncomfortable, right? And like when we were focusing on CDT for sleep, CDTI, people's sleep usually gets worse before it gets better. And I might even use that as an example, because that's just the nature of not avoiding, right? When we avoid things, we feel things. I mean, we don't feel things. And when we start not avoiding things, we're gonna feel things. And by the way, people are gonna have reactions to us not avoiding things, right? We start having conversations. But that's sort of the beauty of IPT, I think, because then week to week, you're coming back in and saying, I had this conversation with my dad, and this is how he responded. How do we respond to that? And I operate from the assumption that there's never an end to a conversation if you don't want there to be. You can always come back. Remember we talked a month ago about me wanting to spend more time with, or less time with Tom and James, or whoever they were? Well, when we talked about that, you said this, and I felt really whatever, right? So you can sort of, it doesn't have to be like the conversation was just yesterday for it to still be relevant. You can circle back to old conversations. So if you open a can of worms, to your example, they get in an argument, the next week, you can still talk about that raw argument and go back and address it. You could even do that in week 15 for that same argument that started. All of that to say, I also talk a lot with clients about sort of simultaneously making sure that they're building other support networks and other support outlets at the same time. Because ideally, we are both addressing the problem area and kind of simultaneously taking away their primary coping resource, which has been food, right, or binging in the case of binging. So I explicitly say that. There's a chance you'll binge even more during, the initial phases of this. But we know that relationships take time to change. And so it's not one conversation with your dad and all is gonna be hunky-dory. You know, it's gonna be an ongoing process. We have 3 months together to work on it. And I think that over the course of the treatment, you will see that improvements in this relationship help reduce the number of times you binge. Even if on the outset, it's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was thinking more, I was thinking, I get the uncomfortable piece when you sort of touch upon a sensitive issue, but I was thinking, could it at times exacerbate your symptoms? Like if they have a parent who's unrelenting, who's just always telling them what a piece of shit they are, and what a piece they are, and that, you know, that's the one mechanism where they can sort of tune out the parent, and now we're sort of inviting, gee, well, doesn't that hurt? And we sort of, you know, sort of give permission to sort of feel that feeling, and then every time they go home, they sort of feel that feeling, and it just makes it feel worse. So that's sort of what I was thinking.
Yes, and I think in that case, in the initial phase, we would have identified that that parent was unrelenting, that there was little hope of changing that relationship if it was really abusive, and then that's not going to be the relationship we're working on. The patient is going to be experiencing increased affect as they sort of hear the parent abuse through raw ears, if you will. But what we're doing is working on relationships where they can get support around the abusive relationship. So
even though you're sort of opening this up, you're pairing it with support or skill, and that's
absolutely, okay, absolutely, yeah. We're going to talk, because the tools here, right, communication analysis and decision analysis are much like the closeness circle, they're interventions. And so we're going to see an example of communication analysis after the lunch break to look in detail about what it looks like to do this interpersonal incident communication analysis, and I'll give you the rationale for doing that. Decision analysis is the final, it's a piece of the puzzle. So, for example, a decision analysis might be the sort of working with your client to determine, is this person like, you know, a safe person to even have these conversations with? And if not, then we need to sort of figure out who we're going to get support from around them. That's part of helping your client navigate these really tricky interpersonal situations. And that's a tool that you can be actively using with your client in the intermediate phase. So that if they come across, you know, the Devil Wears Prada boss later in life, they're like, oh, maybe I don't try to talk this out with her, right? Maybe I develop a really good support network and eventually change jobs. And then the final intermediate phase tool is continuing to link. If there's anything from the literature that suggests that it is critical importance, and if I had a penny for every time Marian said to me, make sure you link, and when I was in training, I would be a rich person. So link the interpersonal relationships to the mood and eating behavior. That is not intuitive to many people. It is to some, but not to all. So it's your job to continually make that link so that they then see improvements in interpersonal relationships also improve my eating. And they're able to make that. So the goals of the therapist here, are to, of course, maintain a supportive therapeutic alliance and to keep the treatment focused on the interpersonal factors. This is where I started talking about it can be really easy to get distracted by wanting to talk about the binge or wanting to talk about diets or weight loss or whatever it is. And it's your job to sort of basically say, I'm going to just interrupt you for a second so that we can really spend our time together today talking about the interpersonal work that is upstream of what you're talking about. So redirecting in a gentle way back to the interpersonal work. Again, I already talked about the begin sessions with how we worked on our goals since we've last met, and then keeping that perspective of the biopsychosocial thing in mind. I'm going to end by just reading, I'll end here. So in the intermediate phases, to wrap up, the therapist is making connections, redirecting issues relating to the eating disorder to the interpersonal context, and staying away from getting into the specifics about what they ate or how they were restricting. So going to the interpersonal. We'll do an example after the lunch. So let's see. Maybe like this 45 minutes sound okay? Yeah? Okay. All right. Yes.